By and large, society's view of how Bram Stoker came to write his famous novel Dracula is essentially cyclical. Stoker was a consummate researcher, read countless books, spent days digging through archives of the British Museum, and picked the brains of numerous world travelers. Through all of this research, he came across tales of Vlad III, or Vlad Tepes, a 15th century ruler and warlord with a penchant for impaling his enemies on stakes in his front lawn, or nailing the turbans of visiting emissaries to their heads, and also had ties to the dark arts. It was through learning about this man that Stoker came to craft his character, Dracula, and to write his novel. So the history influenced the story, which then in turn influenced how people view the history. There's only one problem with all of this. None of it is actually true. My name's Dan, and on a very special Halloween episode of Bookworm History, we're going to be digging into the story and history behind Bram Stoker's Dracula. We can, of course, acknowledge that Stoker took the name Dracula from Vlad III, and more on that later. But ever since he did, people have been looking for connections and parallels between the fictional vampire and the actual historical figure. And today we're going to try and clear the air a little bit by looking at three important aspects of Stoker's vampire: the man himself, his castle, and his name. And then we'll see if we can't find an explanation for how exactly things got so jumbled up. First up, the man himself. Stoker describes his fictional vampire, through the words of Abraham van Helsing, as indeed that voivode Dracula, who won his name against the Turk. He's also described as having been a good man in life, a learned man, possibly an alchemist. He's nobility, a count, who hails from Transylvania. But other than that, Stoker really doesn't go into a whole lot of background about the vampire. Not a whole lot to go on. In reality, Dracula refers to Vlad III, 15th century voivode, not count, of Wallachia, not Transylvania. Now, prior to Stoker's novel, not a whole lot was really known about Vlad III outside of Eastern Europe, where in many places he was and still is thought of as kind of a folk hero, the little guy who stood up against the mighty expanding Ottoman Empire. Truth, unfortunately, is so rarely straightforward, and even during his lifetime, Vlad III earned himself a colorful little nickname, Tepes, or the Impaler. There are a lot of stories swirling around regarding Vlad's penchant for impaling people. While most of these stories were written by the people that he was fighting against, so a little bit of context may be necessary for interpreting them to actually try and determine a little bit about his character, I think it is also safe to say that a man doesn't earn a nickname like the Impaler for nothing. Cruel but just seems to be the prevailing opinion amongst those he was actually ruler of, but there was nothing at all about him being a vampire. Second point, Dracula's Castle. In the novel, Dracula's Castle is a dark, Gothic ruin located high in the Carpathian Mountains just off the Borgo Pass, a dark, foreboding area perfectly suited to the residents of evil incarnate. In reality, the Borgo Pass is a pass through the eastern Carpathian Mountains in Transylvania, but contrary to the novel, it's actually quite a lovely spot, full of rolling hills and green countryside. It's worth mentioning at this point that Stoker never actually visited Transylvania or anywhere near it while he was writing his novel, and he was probably looking at a map, which, given topographical differences, made the area seem much more foreboding than it actually was. As for the castle itself, there are two locations that claim the title of being Dracula's Castle. The first is Ponari Castle in Wallachia, or modern-day Romania. Now, Ponari had absolutely no ties to Stoker whatsoever. He had never heard of it and wasn't aware of its existence at all. And it takes place about 200 kilometers away from where Stoker placed the center of the action for his novel, not to mention it's actually in the wrong province. What it does have is a connection to the real-world Dracula. It was a hideaway and fortress not built by, but certainly built up by, Vlad III, Vlad Tepes. Hence its claim to the name of Dracula's Castle. The second place is Bran Castle, located in Transylvania, and it has no connection to Stoker, Vlad Tepes, or the fictional Dracula whatsoever. What it does have is the benefit of being a Gothic-looking structure located in Transylvania. In the 1970s, as the Iron Curtain was starting to crumble, word was getting through to Romania that there was this big draw for tourists looking for Dracula's Castle, and Bran was an appropriate-looking enough structure, and it was located in Transylvania. So what the heck, they slapped a sign out front, and hence it's forever known as Dracula's Castle. despite having no connection to either the real or imaginary Dracula. Now we come to the name, the real source of a lot of the confusion. Stoker writes in his novel that Dracula won his name fighting the Turk, but that's not exactly correct. Sure, Vlad Tepes did fight against the Turks, but he didn't win the name. You see, that honor actually belonged to dear old dad, Vlad II, who also fought the Turks and was inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a society devoted to fighting the Ottomans. Vlad II thus became known as Vlad Dracul, or Vlad of the Dragon. Vlad Tepes, his son, would thus be known as Vlad Draculia, or Son of the Dragon. So why didn't Stoker know this? If he was such a tireless researcher, as society seems to be led to believe, how did he manage to get so many things wrong? Well, we really can't blame Stoker too much for this. You see, he did work really hard on writing Dracula, and truth be told, it took him 7 years to do it. He wasn't actually a full-time writer. His day job was as acting manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London, which was owned and operated by his friend, legendary actor Henry Irving, who may or may not have inspired some of Count Dracula's character traits. So Stoker was writing Dracula in his spare time. And to figure out exactly how the history got so muddled up, we'll take a look at a timeline of exactly how he wrote the novel. Stoker first mentions what would become Dracula in his notes on March 8, 1890. And he already had a good portion of it worked out. He had a rough outline of the plot, which would be familiar to anybody reading the final novel, as well as the idea to tell it through journal entries and correspondence. He didn't have a title for it. At the time, he just called it The Undead, and his main antagonist didn't have a name yet, but was a vampire. So he had already crafted a good portion of the story as well as the character before he ever heard of Vlad III. Before he ever came across the name of Dracula. So Vlad couldn't have inspired the character, because as far as Stoker's writing was concerned, the character was the first thing he thought of. At the beginning, the antagonist was referred to simply as Count Wampire. Wampire meaning vampire, and Count meaning, well, that he was a bad guy. It was a Victorian horror piece, of course the bad guy was going to be a count. Doesn't really matter who's writing it, if it's Bram Stoker, Charles Dickens, Wilkie Collins. If you come across Count so-and-so in a Victorian horror piece, spoiler alert, there's your bad guy. Sorry to ruin it for you folks. So it's clear that Stoker wasn't writing about Vlad Tepes, the real Dracula. But if that's the case, then where did he get the name from? In July of 1890, Stoker was vacationing with his wife and son in Whitby, a lazy English seaside town, and one of his favorite places to write was the Whitby Library. It was here that he would come across a book, written in 1820, called An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, written by William Wilkinson, who was a former British consul to Bucharest. The book uses the name Dracula only 3 times, and quite inaccurately so. It seems to blend Papa Vlad and Vlad Jr. together as the same person, much in the same way that Stoker would, and that's where he got his cue from. Although it does say that Dracula fought against the Turks, other than that, it really doesn't say a whole lot about them. There was a footnote in the book, though, that got Stoker so excited that he actually copied it word for word into his notes. The footnote says, Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil. Stoker had found the name for his vampire. Why was his history and his background of the character so sparse and inaccurate? Because that's all that was in the book he took the name from. At the end of the day, Stoker didn't really know anything about Vlad Tepes, and he would probably have been pretty surprised to learn about him. He was a guy writing a vampire story, who came across a name he really liked. After the novel became popular, people used it as a starting point for looking into Dracula, which turned out to be Vlad Tepes. But because no one had really heard of Vlad Tepes outside of Eastern Europe before Stoker's novel hit the shelves, there really wasn't a whole lot of information to go on. So the novel started to fill in a lot of the gaps, and misconceptions started to arise. But at the end of the day, as Dracula expert Elizabeth Miller writes, Vlad Tepes is Vlad Tepes, and Count Dracula is Count Dracula. For more information about Dracula, both real and fictional, as well as Bram Stoker's process in writing the novel, I would highly recommend you check out Who Was Dracula by Jim Steinmeyer, as well as Elizabeth Miller's website, which I'll leave a link to down in the description below. As always, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit that subscribe button on your way out so you stay up to date on all of our latest episodes. You can find all of our content in a central location at bookwormhistory.com, and YouTube episodes, blogs, articles, as well as podcasts. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Happy Halloween, and thanks for stopping by. According to Stoker's son Noel, later on describing the story, the novel Dracula was actually inspired by a vivid nightmare that Bram Stoker had had after, as Stoker himself used to put it, a surfeit of stuffed crab. A lot of people think that Dracula was the first English-language vampire story, but the fact is, it's not. Vampire stories have been around in the English language for over 50 years by the time Dracula came out. The first, that honor belongs to a story called The Vampire, spelled with a Y, which was written by John Polidori and came out of the same ghost storytelling session as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Stoker's characterization of Dracula possibly comes from a lot of different sources, most notably Henry Irving, as well as possibly, according to Jim Steinmeyer, Walt Whitman, Jack the Ripper, possibly a few bits of Oscar Wilde scattered in there. What Stoker did also borrow from an actual person was the name of his main protagonist, Jonathan Harker. Harker was the name of a set painter at the Lyceum Theatre, and Stoker later told him that he had actually appropriated his name for a character in his novel.